welcome back to Evil's Comics. This guy right here is Evil Mike, or Mike if you prefer, and this is going to be just me reading the introduction to Stephen King's The Gunslinger. It's the book 1 in the Dark Tower series. In 2 weeks I'm about to do a live discussion, like a read-along, where we read and discuss this book on a live panel. We realized recently that some of the members on the panel only have the audiobook version, and this is the revised and expanded edition of this book. It was the book that, you know, hopefully everybody was going to read, but specifically for the expanded part of it. I was not aware that the introduction and foreword in the revised edition is not a part of the audiobook, so that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to read the introduction and foreword, and that's all it is. It's basically for people that got the audiobook version of this book, or if you have like an older version of this book, you know, that is not in there either. So, you know, if you have this version of the book, then you don't need to listen to this. But I mean, if not, then hey, so let's get started. This is Stephen King's The Gunslinger. It is book 1 in the Dark Tower series, book 1 out of 8. And I'm going to start with the introduction, if I can find it. On being 19 and a few other things. Hobbits were big when I was 19, a number of some import in the stories you're about to read. There are probably half a dozen Merry and Pippins slogging through the mud at Max Yasgar's farm during the Great Woodstock Music Festival, twice as many Frodos and hippie Gandalfs without number. J.R.R. Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings was madly popular in those days, and while I never made it to Woodstock, say sorry, I suppose I was at least a halfling hippie, enough of one at any rate to have read the books and fallen in love with them. The Dark Tower books, like most long fantasy tales written by men and women of my generation, The Chronicles of Thomas Covent by Stephen Donaldson, The Swords of Shannara by Terry Brooks are just 2 of many, were born out of Tolkien's. But although I read in 1966 and 1967, I held off writing. I responded, and with rather touching wholeheartedness, to the sweep of Tolkien's imagination, to the ambition of his story, but I wanted to write my own kind of story, and I had started then. I would have written this, that, as the late tricky Dick Nixon was fond of saying, would have been wrong. Thanks to Mr. Tolkien, the 20th century had all the elves and wizards it needed. 1967, I didn't have an idea with what my kind of story might be, but that didn't matter. I felt positive I'd known it when it passed me on the street. I was 19 and arrogant, certainly arrogant enough to feel I could wait a little while on my muse, my masterpiece, as I was sure it would be. At 19, it seems to me, one has a right to be arrogant. Time has usually not begun its stealthy and rotten subtractions. It takes away your hair and your jump shot, according to popular country song, but in truth it takes away a lot more than that. I didn't know it in 1966 and 67, and if I had, I wouldn't have cared. I could imagine barely being 40, but 50? Nah. 60? Never. 60 was out of the question, and at 19, that's just the way to be. 19 is the age where you say, look out world, I'm smoking TNT and I'm drinking dynamite. So if you know what's good for you, get out of my way. Here comes Stevie. 19's a selfish age and finds one's cares tightly circumscribed. I had a lot of reach and I cared about that. A lot of ambition and I cared about that. I had a typewriter and I cared for one shithole apartment to the next, always with a deck of smokes in my pocket and a smile on my face. The compromises of middle age was distant, the insults of old age over the horizon. Like the protagonist in the Bob Seger song that now used to sell the trucks, I felt endlessly powerful and endlessly optimistic. My pockets were empty, but my head was full of things I wanted to say, and my heart was full of stories I wanted to tell. Sounds corny now, felt wonderful then. Felt very cool. More than anything else, I wanted to get inside my readers' defenses. I wanted to rip them, ravish them, and change them forever with nothing but story. And I felt I could do those things. I felt I was made to do those things. How conceited does that sound? A lot or a little. Either way, I don't apologize. I was 19. There was not so much as a strand of gray in my beard. I had 3 pairs of jeans, 1 pair of boots. The idea of the world was my oyster, and nothing that happened in the next 20 years proved me wrong. Then, around the age of 39, my troubles set in. Drinks, drugs, a road accident that changed the way I walked, among other things. I've written about them at length and need not write about them here. Besides, it's the same for you, right? The world eventually sends out a mean-ass patrol boy to slow your progress and show you who's boss. You're reading this undoubtedly, met yours or will. I met mine, and I'm sure he'll be back. He's got my address. He's a mean guy, a bad lieutenant, the sworn enemy of a goofery, fuckery, pride, ambition, loud music, and all things 19. But I still think that's a pretty fine age. Maybe the best age. You can rock and roll all night, but when the music dies out, the beer wears off, you're able to think. Dream big dreams. The mean patrol boy cuts you down to size eventually, and if you start out small, why, there's almost nothing left but the cuffs of your pants when he's done with you. Got another one? He shouts, and strides on with the citation book in his hand. So a little arrogance, or even a lot, isn't such a bad thing, although your mother undoubtedly told you different. Mine did. Pride goeth before a fall, Stephen, she said, and then I found out, right around the age that is 19 times 2, that eventually you fall down. Anyway, or get pushed into a ditch. At 19, they can card you in the bars and tell you to get the fuck out, put the sorry act and sorry your ass back on the street, but they can card you when you sit down to paint a picture, write a poem, or tell a story. And by God, if you're reading this, happen to be very young, don't let your elders and supposed betters tell you any different. Sure, you've never been to Paris. No, you've never ran with the bulls at Polonia. Yes, you're a pissant who had no hair in his armpits until 3 years ago, but so what? If you don't start out too big for your britches, how are you going to fill them when you grow up? Let it rip regardless of what anybody tells you. That's my idea. Sit down and smoke that, baby. Chapter 2 in this introduction. I think novelists come in 2 types, and that includes the sort of fleeting novelist I was by 1970. Those who are bound for the more literal or serious side of the job examine every possible subject in light of that question. What would writing this sort of story mean to me? Those whose destiny, or ka, if you like, is to include the writing of popular novels are apt to ask a very different one. What would writing this sort of story mean to others? The serious novelist is looking for answers and keys to the self. The popular novelist is looking for an audience. Both kind of writers are equally selfish. I've known a good many and will set my watch and warrant upon it. Anyway, I believe that even at the age of 19, I recognized the story of Frodo and his efforts to rid himself of the one great ring as one belongs to the second group. They were the adventures of an existential British band of pilgrims set against the backdrop of vaguely Norse mythology. I liked the idea of the quest, loved it, in fact. But I had no interest in either Tolkien's sturdy pheasant characters, that's not to say I didn't like them because I did, or his bosky Scandinavian settings, or bosky. If I tried going in that direction, I'd get it all wrong. So I've waited. By 1970, I was 22. The first strands of gray had showed up in my beard. I think smoking 2.5 packs of Pall Malls a day probably had something to do with that. But even at 22, one can afford to wait. At 22, time is still on one side, although even then, that bad old patrol boy's in the neighborhood and asking questions. Then, in an almost complete, empty movie theater, the Bangor, Maine, if it matters, I saw a film directed by Sergio Leone. It was called The Good, the Bad, the Ugly. And before the film was half over, I realized that I wanted to write a novel that contained Tolkien's sense of quest and magic, but set it against Leone's almost absurdly majestic Western backdrop. If you've only seen the gonzo Western on your television screen, you do not understand what I'm talking about. Cry your pardon, but it's true. On a movie screen projected through the correct Panavision lens, TG, TB, and TU is an epic to rival Ben-Hur. Clint Eastwood appears roughly 18 feet tall, with each wiry jet of stubble on his cheeks looking roughly the size of a young redwood tree. The groves bracketed Lee Van Cleef's mouth are as deep as canyons, and there could be a thinny, see Wizard and Glass for that, at the bottom of each one. The desert settings appear to stretch at least out as far as the orbit of the planet Neptune, and the barrel of each gun looks to be roughly as large as the Holland Tunnel. What I wanted even more than the setting was the feeling of an epic, apocalyptic size. The fact that Leone knew jack shit about American geography. According to one of his characters, Chicago is somewhere near the vicinity of Phoenix, Arizona, added to the film's sense of magnificent dislocation, and in my enthusiasm, the sort only a young person can muster. I think I wanted to write not just a long book, but the longest popular novel in history. I did not succeed in doing that, but I feel I have a decent rip. The Dark Tower, volumes 1 through 7, really comprise a single tale, and the first 4 volumes run to just over 2,000 pages in paperback. The final 3 volumes ran another 2,500 in manuscript. I'm not trying to imply here that the length has anything whatsoever to do with quality. I'm just saying that I wanted to write an epic. In some ways I succeeded. If you were to ask me why I wanted to do that, I couldn't tell you. Maybe it's part of growing up American. Build the tallest, dig the deepest, write the longest. And that head-scratching puzzlement when the question of motivation comes up. Seems to me that that is also part of being an American. In the end, we are reduced to saying, it seemed like a good idea at the time. Chapter 3. Another thing about being 19, do it please ya, is the age, I think, where a lot of us somehow get stuck mentally and emotionally, if not physically. The years slide by, and one day you find yourself looking into the mirror with real puzzlement. Why are those lines on my face, you wonder? Where did that stupid pot belly come from? Hell, I'm only 19. This is hardly an original concept, but that in no way subtracts from one's amazement. Time puts gray in your beard, time takes away your jump shot, and all the while you're thinking, silly you, time is still on your side. The logical side of you knows better, but your heart refuses to believe it. If you're lucky, the patrol boy who cited you for going too fast and having too much fun also gave you a dose of smelling salts. That was more or less what happened to me. Near the end of the 20th century, it came in the form of a Plymouth van that knocked me into the ditch beside a road in my hometown. About 3 years after that accident, I did a book signing from a Buick 8 at a border store in Dearborn, Michigan. When one day, one guy got to the head of the line and said he was really, really glad that I was still alive. I get this a lot, and it beats the shit out of why the hell didn't you die? I was with this good friend of mine when we heard you got popped. He said, man, we just started shaking our heads and saying, there goes the tower. It's tilting, it's falling. Aw, shit, he'll never finish it now. A version of the same idea had occurred to me. The troubling idea that, having built the Dark Tower in the collective imagination of millions of readers, I might have a responsibility to make it safe for as long as people wanted to read about it. That might be for only 5 years. For all I know, it might be 500. Fantasy stories, the bad as well as the good. Even now, someone out there is probably reading Varney the Vampire or the Monk, seem to have long shelf lives. Roland's way of protecting the tower is to try and remove the threat to the beams that hold the tower up. I would have done it. I realized after my accident by finishing the Gunslinger story. During the long pauses between the writing and publication of the first 4 Dark Tower tales, I received hundreds of pack your bags, we're going on a guilt trip letters. In 1998, when I was laboring under the mistaken impression that I was still basically 19, in other words, I got one from an 82-year-old grandma. Don't mean to bother you with my troubles, but I'm very sick these days. The grandma told me she probably had only a year to live. 14 months at most, outside cancer, all through me. While she didn't expect to finish Roland's tale in the time just just for her. She wanted to know if I could please just tell her how it came out. The line that wrenched my heart, although not quite enough to start writing again, was her promise to not tell a single soul. A year later, probably after the accident that landed me in the hospital, one of my assistants, Marcia D. Filippo, got a letter from a fellow on death row in either Texas or Florida, wanting to know essentially the same thing. How does it come out? How does it turn out? He promised to take the secrets to his grave with him, which gave me the creeps. I would have gave both of these folks what they wanted, a summary of Roland's further adventures, if I could have done. But alas, I couldn't. I had no idea how things were going to turn out with the gunslinger and his friends. To know I have to write, I once had an outline, but I lost it along the way. It probably wasn't worth a tin shit anyway. All I had was a few notes. Chusset, chasset, chasset, something basket. Reads one lying on the desk as I write this. Eventually, starting in July of 2001, I began to write again. I knew by then I was no longer 19, not exempt from any of the ills to which the flesh is hair. I knew I was going to be 60, maybe even 70, and I wanted to finish my story before the bad patrol boy came for the last time. I had no urge to be filled away with the Canterbury Tales or the mystery of Edwin Drood. The result, for better or worse, lies before you. Constant reader, whether you're reading this at starting with Volume 1 or preparing for Volume 5, like it or hate it, the story of Roland is now done. I hope you enjoy it. As for me, I had the time of my life. Stephen King, January 25th, 2003. Foreword. Most of what writers write about their work is ill-informed bullshit. And he puts like a disclaimer at the bottom, and it says, for full discussion of the bullshit factor, see On Writing, published by Schreibers in 2000. That's his book on writing. That is why you have never seen a book entitled 100 Great Introductions of Western Civilization or Best Left Forewords of American People. This is a judgment call on my part, of course, but after writing at least 50 introductions and forewords, not to mention an entire book about the craft of fiction, I think it's one I have a right to make. I think you can take me seriously when I tell you that this might be one of those rare occasions upon which I actually have something worth saying. A few years ago, I created some furor among my readers by offering a revised and expanded version of my novel, The Stand. I was justifiably nervous about the book because The Stand has always been the novel my readers have loved the best, as far as the most passionate of the Stand fans are concerned. I could have died in 1980 without making the world a noticeable poorer place. If this is a story that rivals The Stand in the imagination of King's readers, it's probably the tale of Roland Deschain and his search for the Dark Tower. And now, goddammit, I'm gone and done the same thing again. Except I haven't. Not really. I want you to know it. I also want you to know what I have done and why. It may not be important to you, but it's very important to me, and thus the foreword is exempt, I hope, from King's bullshit rule. First, please be reminded that The Stand sustained deep cuts in manuscript not for editorial reasons, but financial ones. There were binding limitations too, but I don't even want to go there. When I reinstated in the late 80s were revised sections of pre-existing manuscripts. I also revised the work as a whole, mostly to acknowledge the AIDS epidemic, which blossomed, if that is the word, between the first issue of The Stand and the publication of the revised edition 8 or 9 years later. The result was a volume about 100,000 words longer than the original. In the case of The Gunslinger, the original volume was slim, and the added material in the version amounts to a mere 35 pages, or about 9,000 words. If you've read The Gunslinger before, you only find 2 or 3 totally new scenes here. Dark Tower pursuits, or which there are a surprising number, just check the web. Will want to read the book again. And of course, most of them are apt to do so with a mixture of curiosity and irritation. I sympathize, but must say I'm less concerned with them than with readers who are never encountered Roland and his quartet. And it says, the disclaimer at the bottom, it says, those bound by destiny is what quartet means. In spite of the fervent followers, the Tale of the Tower is far less known by the readers than is The Stand. Sometimes when I do readings, I ask those present to raise their hands if they've read one or more of my novels. Since they bother to come at me at all, sometimes going to the added inconvenience of hiring a babysitter or incurring the added expense of gassing up the old sedan, it comes as no surprise that most of them raise their hands. Then I'll ask them to keep their hands up if they've read one or more of the Dark Tower stories. When I do that, at least half the hands in the hall invariably go down. The conclusion is clear enough. Although I've spent an inordinate amount of time writing these books in the 33 years between 1970 and 2003, comparatively few people have read them. Yet those are passionate about them, and I'm fairly passionate myself, enough so, in any case, that I was never able to let Roland creep away into the exile, which is unhappy home of unfulfilled characters. Think of Southsea's Pilgrims on the Way to Canterbury, or the people who populate Charles Dickens' unfinished final novel, The Mystery of Edwin Drood. I think that I'm always assumed, somewhere in the back of my mind, for I cannot even remember thinking about this consciously, that there would be time to finish, that perhaps God would even send me a signal telegram at the appointed hour. Deedle-dum, deedle-dower, get back to work, Stephen, finish the tower. In a way, something like that really did happen, although it wasn't a singing telegram, but a close encounter with a Plymouth minivan that got me going again. If the vehicle that struck me that day had been a little bigger, or if the hit had been just a little squarer, it would have been a case of mourners, please omit flowers. The King family thanks you for your sympathy, and Roland's quest would have remained forever unfinished, at least by me. In any case, in 2001, by which time I began to feel more myself again, I decided the time had come to finish Roland's story. I pushed everything aside to set work on the final 3 books. As always, I did this not so much for the readers who demanded it as for myself. Although the revisions of the last 2 volumes still remain to be done as I write this in the winter of 2003, the books themselves were finished late summer, and in the hiatus between the editorial work on Volume 5, Wolves of the Calla, and Volume 6, Songs of Susanna, I decided the time had come to go back to the beginning and start the final overall revisions. Why? Because these 7 volumes were never really separate stories at all, but sections of a single long novel called The Dark Tower, and the beginning was out of sync with the ending. My approach to revision hasn't changed much over the years. I know there are writers who do it as they go along, but my method of attacks have always been to plunge in, go as fast as I can, keeping the edge of the narrative bland as sharp as possible by constant use, and trying to outrun novelist's most insidious enemy, which is doubt. Looking back prompts too many questions. How believable are my characters? How interesting is my story? How good is this really? Will anyone care? Do I care myself? When my first draft of the novel was done, I put it away, warts and all, to mellow. Some period of time later, 6 months, a year, 2 years, it doesn't really matter. I can come back to it with a cooler but still loving eye and begin the task of revising. And although each book of the Tower series was revised as a separate entity, I never really looked at the work as a whole until I finished Volume 7, The Dark Tower. When I looked back at the first volume, which you now hold in your hand, 3 obvious truths presented themselves. The first was that The Gunslinger had been written by a very young man and had all the problems of a very young man's book. The second was that it contained a great many errors and false starts, particularly in the light of the volumes that followed. There's a disclaimer. It says one of the examples would probably serve for all. In the previous issued text of The Gunslinger, Farson is the name of a town. In later volumes, it somehow became the name of a man, the rebel John Farson, who engineers the fall of Gilead, the city-state where Roland spent his childhood. The third was that Gunslinger did not even sound like the later books. It was frankly rather difficult to read. All too often I heard myself apologizing for it and telling people that if they persevered, they would find the story really found its voice in the drawing of the 3. At one point in The Gunslinger, Roland is described as the sort of man who would straighten pictures in a strange hotel room. I'm that sort of guy myself, and to some extent, that is all the rewriting amounts to. Straightening the pictures, vacuuming the floors, scrubbing the toilets, I did a great deal of housework in the course of the revision, and I had a chance to do what any writer wants to do with a work that is finished but still needs a final polish and tune-up. Just make it right. Once you know how things come out, you owe it to the potential reader and to yourself to go back and put things in order. That is what I have tried to do here, always being careful that in an addition or change should give away the secrets hidden in the last 3 books of this cycle. Secrets I have been patiently keeping for as long as 30 years in some cases. Before I close, I should say a word about the younger man who dared to write this book. The young man had been exposed to far too many writing seminars and had grown far too used to the ideas those seminars promulgate. The one is writing for other people rather than oneself. The language is more important than story. The ambiguity is to be preferred over clarity and simplicity, which are usually signs of a thick, literal mind. As a result, I am not surprised to find a high degree of pretension in Roland's debut appearance, not to mention what seemed like thousands of unnecessary adverbs. I removed as much of this hollow banter as I could and do not regret a single cut made in that regard. In other places, invariably, those where I'd been seduced into forgetting the writing seminar ideas by some particular entrancing piece of story, I was able to let writing almost entirely alone, save for the usual bits of revision, and writer needs to do so. As I have pointed out in another context, only God gets it right the first time. In any case, I didn't want to muzzle or even really change the way this story is told, but for all faults, it had its own special charms, it seems to me. To change it to completely would have been prudent. The person who first wrote of the Gunslinger in the late spring and early summer of 1970, and that I did not want to do. What I did want to do, and before the final volumes of the series came out, if possible, was to give newcomers the tale of the tower, and all readers who want to refresh their memories a clearer start and a slightly easier entry into Roland's world. I also wanted them to have a volume that more effectively foreshadowed coming events. I hope I have done that, and if you are one of those readers who have never visited the strange world through which Roland and his friends move, I hope you enjoy the marvels you find there. More than anything else, I wanted to tell a tale of wonder. If you find yourself falling under the spell of the Dark Tower even a little bit, I reckon I will have done my job, which was begun in 1970 and largely finished in 2003. Yet Roland would be the first to point out such a span of time means very little. In fact, which one quest for the Dark Tower, time is a matter of no concern at all. February 6, 2023, and that is the introduction and the foreword. Woo! That is a whole bunch. Okay, guys, thanks for sitting here and listening to this. Hopefully you needed that, if you were missing it. But hey, that's all I got for you. I'll let you go.